Today I want to talk about breeding shrimp for profit and my experiences I've had while breeding shrimp for profit, and talk about the things I've come across and what I've found to work and not work for me. And I thought I'd share it because I think people would be interested. I've had quite a lot of people reach out to me and ask about how my shrimp are getting on and what I've found and stuff like that, so I thought I'd make a video on it. So the first thing I'll touch on is when I initially got into it, I'd done a lot of research online and was looking at what other people were recommending on YouTube and stuff like that. And while it might work for them, I found some of the advice that they were giving out didn't necessarily work for me. Now, I'm not an expert on shrimp keeping, so I just want to put that out there, but I wanted to share my experiences and what I've learned while breeding them. Now, when I first started out, I started with all these, the small containers and stuff like that that people recommend. And what I found is I wasn't having much success with them. I wasn't seeing many females carrying eggs. Maybe the shrimp was still a bit young, and it was just finding what would work for me. And then I came across Mark's video on Mark's Shrimp Tanks on his setting up the blue shrimp with his pleco. I think it was the Bristol nose pleco, and I thought, you know what, I'll give that a try. And what I realised was with Mark, he was using a bigger tank and he put his pleco in, so he was feeding heavier, and the system was set up so it could handle a higher level of food, and the parameters would be more stable. So what I did is I added my shrimp, my colony of 10 red cherry shrimp, to this tank, and it's a 5-foot tank and it's about 300 litres. I added it and it's heavily planted, or I've been adding more plants as I've been going, and as people know, plants help maintain stability in an aquarium. They help process waste and stuff like that, and I thought, well, the size of the water volume and the plants will help keep the water parameters stable for the shrimp, and that's what I found to happen. I feel like it gave me an extra level of benefit with breeding shrimp. As you can see, I added pleco caves at the back, and I initially added 3 Bristol nose plecos. I added what I thought was a male and 2 females. It turns out that all 3 of them were male, and I've since gone back and bought a female, which is sat on the piece of wood in front here. But what I realised is instantly, as soon as I did this with the bigger tank and all the heavy plants and the plecos, I instantly started feeding to maintain the plecos and not the shrimp anymore. It gave me a totally different outlook on how I should be feeding the tank. And then what I noticed, as soon as I started feeding this way, I noticed straight away a massive impact on the shrimp. I noticed a lot of buried females. Not instantly, but quite quickly, I noticed the shrimp started to get buried up. And with having the plecos in the tank, I changed the diet, because a lot of the people were saying just feed flake and stuff like that, crushed flake and things like that. And tied in with like what Mark's Shrimp Tanks was saying with like the blanched nettles, I was feeding for the plecos, so I was throwing stuff in there like rapashi, flake, pellets, or cucumber, courgette, blanched spinach. I was throwing all sorts of veggies in there, and algae wafers, and I was just adding a much more balanced diet. As soon as I did that, female shrimp just became buried really quickly, and before that I'd struggled for months to try and get buried females. So this is one of the corners of my tank where I regularly throw food in, and as you can see, there's a nice little population of shrimp hanging around here on the food eating, but they're not just in this corner. They are literally all over the tank. I don't know whether you can see them, and there's a good example. There's a buried female right there on that leaf, and I just see a lot of buried females all the time. I see a lot of tiny shrimplets swimming around. And there's another area of shrimp, and there's my female Bristol nose pleco. So as you can see, I had a lot of success with my colony of red cherry shrimp. As soon as I put them in this 5-foot tank, started feeding heavily, it was planted, and I put the Bristol nose pleco in there. I just found my whole philosophy on how I was keeping the shrimp changed. I started feeding more generously. I started giving them a more varied diet, and I just noticed within a couple of weeks the population started to explode. There was shrimplets everywhere, and I thought, you know what, based on the success I'm having with this colony, I thought I'd try the blues with the same method. So I put the blues in a 4-foot tank, planted tank down here, and that had peppermint bristlenose in, and straight away within a couple of weeks the blues were buried as well. I've since removed them from this tank and I've put them in the tank behind you. So as you can see here, my colony started expanding as soon as I put them in the tank. They were only in the tank briefly, but the population started growing straight away. I seen buried females, and then within a couple of weeks there were shrimplets in the tank, and I found that this suits my style of keeping shrimp. And there's all shrimp across the top of the tank. I find that they like sitting on floating plants and picking them. So it definitely worked out, and I found a technique that works for me. It might not work for everyone. It's just that for me, these are the sizes of the tanks I'm used to keeping, and my experience around keeping aquariums are usually aquariums this size. So for me, it was no surprise that I found success with aquariums this size, and it wouldn't surprise me if the people who were keeping shrimps in smaller tanks, that's where their experience lay. Maybe they're aquascapers or something like that, where they're used to keeping smaller tanks with nanofish, so that their experience with shrimp, and success with shrimp might come from the fact that they're experienced at keeping their style of aquariums. And mine, I probably find I didn't have as much success with tanks that big because my experience never evolved around tanks that size. Now when it comes to selling shrimp, I was a bit surprised with how the market responded to me, to be honest. The first thing I did was went to my local fish shop and was talking to them. Now I have a good relationship with my local fish shop, so when I offered them shrimp for sale, basically they told me to bring them what I had, which I was surprised by at first, but I ended up taking about 40, and I think it was, and letting them have that, and I picked up a few projects that I could focus on. But what I found is most shops are looking at about paying about 50 pence to a pound for shrimp, but they want quite a lot, so you can make your money quickly. You could probably make 20 to 40 pounds, somewhere like that, based on my experience with, but you need to take in the amount of shrimp that they want to sell. Now with the private sellers and stuff like that, although I didn't sell, I went to an auction and all the shrimp was snapped up, yellows, blues, reds, they all went, and they all went for a bit of a higher price point. Now I also came across a guy who was breeding shrimp in tanks smaller than what I am, kind of in between where people on YouTube were recommending them and the tank size I used, because if I'm totally honest, I wouldn't say that this is necessarily the best tank size. I'd say it's somewhere in between what other people are recommending and what I'm recommending, probably for me anyway. But when I was speaking to this breeder, he said he was listing them for about £1.50, and people were turning up and buying 100 at a time, which surprised me a lot. Now that might be an outlier, but that's just the conversation I had with him, and that's what he told me had happened to him, because I went to pick a colony of shrimp up off him and they'd all sold by the time he listed them. Straight away I said I'd buy them. By the time it took me to walk the half hour from my house to his house, they'd gone. So it shows you that there's a good market out there for shrimp. So what are my plans for the future now? So now I've figured out a method that I can keep shrimp. I think with the tank sizes I was using a 250 litre and a 300 litre tank, and although I had success growing in them, the problem I found is I was getting culls in the tank, like wild type shrimp and clear shrimp. There's some at the back behind you and there's some in this tank, and in a tank this size I think they're quite hard to deal with. So I think maybe 150 litre tank, something like that, heavily planted, is what I'd go to next, and get some plecos in there. So I think that'd give me a nice balance, maybe growing out some plecos in with shrimp. And I'd like to add a few more colours to my collection. I've got my blues, I've got my reds, I've got yellows, and I've kept them using the old technique, and I find that the colony's basically just maintaining itself, it's not growing, whereas my blues started growing as soon as I put them in the tank. My reds I've had the most success with, they're the ones I was playing with first. Obviously they're the most common shrimp, so I thought if I have any problems with my new technique, then they'll be the easiest colony to replace, but they exploded. So I think I'd like to go to probably about 150 litres, something around that mark. So the tank's big enough to sustain a colony of shrimp, maybe with some plecos I'm growing out. Gives me the opportunity to feed quite heavily compared to a smaller tank, and a more variety of diet. At the same time, it's also small enough that I can dig out any culls, put them in my cull tank, because I keep a cull tank of wild type shrimp. Some of them colour up and I take them back out and put them in the tank. When they're a bit older they seem to take a while, some of them to get the colour, some get the colour really small. But I think my goal has been to grow out some colonies, and I've always felt reluctant to sell them on a bit, because I want my colonies to be big enough that if I sell a lot, because I was surprised by the numbers that people were buying, so if I sell at that level, then I can quickly get my colony back up to the level it'll sustain itself. I thought people would just buy like 1s and 2s and 4s and shops would buy 10s, but no, they seem to, like, the market seems to be hungry for shrimp. And I like to add some greens and browns and oranges and some other colours to my collection. I'd like to get a nice setup of racks where I've got good sized tanks and I've got a variety of different shrimp to go in them, and something that's small enough that I can cull but big enough where I can balance the aquarium and I can feed quite heavily compared to what other people are suggesting. So that's my experience so far with breeding cherry shrimp for profit. Now if you've got any questions, feel free to ask me. I'm not sure whether I've covered everything that people might be interested in, but I'll be happy to answer comments in the comment section and share any information that people are curious about that I've found. And if you've enjoyed this information, please consider giving the video a like. It tells YouTube to put it out to a bigger audience. And if you want to see updates on me shrimp colonies and what I'm up to, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel out massively. As the channel gets more subs, it grows and it gets put out to a wider audience, so it helps the channel grow, it helps me pass out information to other people. But take care anyway, see you soon.